Вы хотите декоммунизации? Ну что же, нас это вполне устраивает. Но не нужно, что называется, останавливаться на полпути. Мы готовы показать вам, что значит для Украины настоящая декоммунизация.
Это россияне. Hello. Are we back now? Is my microphone wasn't properly set up, but I think that is it because it's registering on OBS. So if someone could just confirm that the microphone is working now, would be very, very handy. Waiting to confirm because for some reason it wasn't connected. It's showing up in OBS now, but I don't want to be. Okay, yep. Come through on the stream that I'm listening to. So hello everybody, how is everyone doing? Been a couple of weeks since we last streamed, and there's been a lot of developments at the front in Ukraine. Mike is working, put it in mono instead of stereo. So look. Audio properties. How's that? Is that it now? Is that sounding better for you guys now? Let me know as we go. So, with the obligatory audio issue out of the way, it's been a couple of weeks since we streamed, and there's been quite a fair few developments strategically and tactically in theater in what's happened in Ukraine. I'm a little bit under the weather at the moment, so I apologize. I know it's been a while since we've streamed, but I'm afraid this will have to be a fairly snippy stream. Because I'm not too sure how long my throat will be able to stay in it today. So we're gonna jump straight into it and give you guys a quick rundown of everything that's happened since we last streamed. So the last stream, if I remember off the top of my head, we were mostly still covering the aftermath of the Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Wagner incident domestically in Russia, and also the up until then developments in the Ukrainian counteroffensive. Since then, there are a few more developments specifically into that, but before we delve straight into the tactical situation in Ukraine, we're going to first of all talk a little bit about the strategic, because there's been some interesting developments along that line. So if you are in the Telegram channel, which I imagine everyone who listens to this will be, but if you somehow aren't, the vast majority of everything I do in regards to this, I do on my Telegram, is showed here, t.me/mdelabrox, mdelabrox. That is the Telegram channel. This is where I do the vast majority of my sort of updates in commentary, as it were, whenever I'm not doing streams. Well, for those who are in there, or rather for those who aren't, I'll give a quick update. Kind of the big strategic situation that's developed this week, really, is developments around the Black Sea and the breakdown of the grain deal. We're just going to touch a little bit on the ramifications and the reasons why, and how I seem to have gotten it rather wrong on the grain deal. So for people who are not in the Telegram channel, just a quick recap, my sort of commentary was, well, first of all, just a bit of history. Of course, in the early stages of the invasion, the Russians very rapidly took over this very small island here, Yemeni Island, also known more commonly in English-speaking countries as Snake Island. This is it here, as you can see, very small, but just off the coast of this marsh area of Budzak in southern Ukraine, down here on the border of Romania. And this was a very strategically important part of territory for Russia and also for Ukraine to hold at the time. This is where the infamous propagandized incident of the Ukrainian soldiers surrendering to the ill-fated at the time Moskva, Russian flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, in the opening stages of the invasion happened on this island. But the more strategic implications was its proximity to the Ukrainian coast and the control over waterways that this provided Russia during the early stages of the conflict. Because, as you could probably just make out this little measurement here, we're talking about 30 to 40 miles, potential kilometers. It's about just around about between 30 and 40 kilometers from Snake Island to the coast of the mainland, which meant that pretty much any fairly medium to large scale vessel that attempted to pass into Ukrainian waters from Romania in that time would have been visually spotted by Russian soldiers, troops on the island. It was a bit ambiguous as to what the equipment the Russians had actually physically put on Snake Island. Of particular note was anti-ship ballistic missiles, weaponry of that caliber, which was a linchpin in the Atlan stage of the Russian naval blockade of Ukraine. People might remember very early in the early stages of the war, Odessa was often filming. You could stand on the beach in Odessa and you could see Russian naval vessels off the shore, occasionally firing into, well, not onto the city itself, but probing potential sea mines that the Ukrainians might have laid. Just in general, menacing and blockading Odessa and Nikolaev ports, and effectively turning Ukraine into a landlocked country. That was in the early stages of the war. Then as the invasion itself started to fall apart and the Russians started to lose their ground towards April last year into May, the Ukrainians started to go on the offensive, and part of that offensive was a constant Ukrainian artillery striking, and particularly the Bayraktar drones hitting Russian targets on Snake Island. And long story short, it became unfeasible and untenable for the Russians to maintain control of the island. The Russians pulled out of the island, I think it was July last year. Can't remember the exact date off the top of my head, but the Russians vacated the island. The Ukrainians came back onto the island. And this was kind of the big prerequisite to the establishment of the quote-unquote grain deal. And my interpretation of that was, it was just kind of, once the Russians had, well, after the sinking of the Moskva and the loss of Snake Island, is the Russians kind of lost their dominant advantage in the Black Sea. And then you had the various drone attacks, the seaborne drones on Russian ships and Port Sevastopol. That kind of relegated the Russian Black Sea fleet to very minimal operations out at sea, or to littoral operations, littoral being effectively just hugging the coast or relegated to port. That kind of opened up a opportunity for the Ukrainians, because of course Ukraine is a large producer of cereals and wheats and grains. So is Russia. And part of the pro-Ukrainian international narrative, which was very much backed up by its Western benefactors, was that this Russian naval blockade, which had become moot by this point, was effectively starving Africa and the third world to famine. And it was another aspect of Russian perfidy and how bad and evil Moscow is by starving Africa, by not allowing Ukrainian grain to go to market, and effectively to move on to third world destinations, which were usually large importers of Ukrainian grain. Just a quick wrap up why that was. Why didn't Ukraine send it through Poland? Well, apparently the rail gauges between Ukraine and Poland, or Ukraine still maintains the old Soviet rail gauge, and all ex-Soviet countries, so Romania, Hungary, Slovakia, and Poland, don't use that gauge. So the transfer of grain between trains would become very tedious and costly. But also is that apparently the port that would then have been used to export this Ukrainian grain, if it went to Poland, would have been Gdansk, and they don't have the correct port facilities to offload this grain. From a video I can remember watching last year, that was the explanation given. But also, the Poles are very reticent to have their own domestic agricultural market flooded with Ukrainian grain stock. So the way to get around this last year, and also to kind of bring in a bit of state revenue for the Ukrainian state, was the grain deal. The grain deal, my interpretation was it was forced on Russia. Russia was not really an equal partner to it. It wasn't a case of the Russian Navy willingly stood down in a agreement between nations to allow this deal to go ahead. It was more the Russian hands were tied after the loss of Snake Island and the relegation of the Black Sea Fleet to port. I didn't really see what much the Russians could do to stop the export of grain at this stage, because, like I say, Snake Island particularly prevented the possibility of Ukrainian ships hugging the Romanian coast, staying in Romanian territorial waters where they would be quote unquote safe, and then slipping into Ukrainian territorial waters while maintaining a very close to shore transit up to Odessa. The Snake Island kind of removed that possibility for that to happen. With the Ukrainians back in control of that island, that pushed out the Russian ability to interdict these ships were they willing to do that at any point from achieving that, because you could imagine there'll be Ukrainian facilities on Snake Island that project out radar, not to mention you have constant NATO AWACS and intel flights ongoing across the Black Sea. So if the Russians ever got into their heads to say, like, attack grain ships with aircraft-borne anti-ship missiles, you could imagine the second they left Russian airspace, or even before they left Russian airspace to go out on their sorties, is all this NATO AWACS and intel flights in the Black Sea, and Ukrainian radars potentially on Snake Island or hugging the coast would pick them up, and then you'd have Ukrainian aircraft go out on to intercept them, or Ukrainian SAMs batteries on the coast that might try and intercept these Russian aircraft sorties against grain ships. That was one aspect of it. Russian naval shipping as well comes under the same problem. The Moskva, of course, was sunk fairly far out to sea, so Russian ships couldn't really go too close into the shore, into the Ukrainian shore, for fear of running within range of the Neptune missiles and other Ukrainian anti-ship systems. So it was kind of forced on Russia, and it was more of a face-saving, seemed to be a face-saving, a face-saving aspect on the Russian part. The other aspect, of course, was these ships were escorted by the Turkish Navy. The Russians were never really going to risk conflict with Turkey and therefore NATO. This is something that both sides are dead set against. So that's what kind of established the grain deal, which has ran for about a year now. But over the past week, the Ukrainians have launched more drone attacks across Crimea, but particularly it appears that there was a seaborne drone attack on the Crimean Bridge, which has damaged one of the road spans of the bridge. And in response to that, the Russians have used that as an excuse to pull out of the deal. And this kind of caught me by a bit surprised, because I thought the Russians had effectively vacated most of their leverage. But what I didn't anticipate was the actions of the Turkish Navy. Turkey is a very enigmatic actor in this war. It tries to play both sides, but over the past couple of weeks, it has very much veered very strongly to a more pro-Ukrainian message. The announcement of more military aid to Ukraine, the announcement that there was a visit of Zelensky to Ankara, which also secured the release against an agreement between Ukraine, Russia, and Turkey over the Azov prisoners from Mariupol, who were meant to remain in Turkey until the end of hostilities in Ukraine. That was effectively unilaterally broken on the Turkish side, who allowed the Azov prisoners to return to Ukraine over the past couple of weeks, breaking that agreement. And those Azov prisoners are actually starting to turn back up at the front. The Azov battalion is making a lot on their social media about that at the moment. So the Ukrainians very much broke that broke their side of the agreement there. As a part of Zelensky coming to visit Erdogan in Turkey was meant to be followed up by an official visit by Vladimir Putin to Turkey. That fell apart. So the Turks seemed to very much sort of spin one way. And part of this growing, they also are stepping up their military action in Syria. Of course, Russia has a direct competitor towards Turkish influence in Syria. So Turkey became very bellicose against Moscow since the presidential elections that happened in Turkey a month or so ago. So I was kind of expecting a more bellicose stance from the Turks in regards to the grain deal, but to my surprise, it was the Turks who cucked. Whenever the Russians announced they were pulling out of the grain deal, I thought it was effectively a moot point because, yeah, the Russians could target the port infrastructure, but the ships themselves would be escorted by Turkish naval vessels, and the Russians would not dare any military action towards those. But to my surprise, the Turks have unilaterally said that they will no longer escort the grain vessels in response to the threat of Russian military action against them. So I found that quite surprising, and I didn't anticipate that. So I was a bit wrong on the grain deal there. The ramifications of the collapse of the grain deal is it's kind of one of these very few direct agreements between Russia and Ukraine that has fallen apart. So that it's the closing off of one angle of dialogue, and kind of is pushing out a bit more of the influence that Turkey holds with both sides during the conflict. But also it means this might be a moot point because effectively the entire Ukrainian state is just underwritten by its Western benefactors. But it means that there will be less state revenue going back to Ukraine, which means it will have to rely even more on the United States and European countries to effectively pay for Ukraine to continue the functions of government and its military. But also a interesting announcement by Moscow over the past couple of days is that the aspect is the way the Western states and the Ukrainian state has sort of pushed this is that this is Russia trying to starve the third world again, and they're trying to hurt Russian influence, particularly in Africa. Of course, not going to go deep dive into this stream, but of course, Russia has growing a very substantial, growing influential base in Africa at the moment, with the Wagner group, of particular note of building up this sort of quasi Russian empire across Africa. Of course, what that will manifest itself going forward as the situation with Wagner and Prigozhin evolves in the aftermath of the events of last month, who knows? But nonetheless, is that Russia holds substantial influence in countries such as Mali, the Central African Republic being the very big base that they do. They've got feelers going out into Burkina Faso, Mauritania. Where else was there? I believe they still have a lingering influence in Mozambique, and also they have Wagner and Russian influence is starting to make itself felt in the conflict in Sudan and also in the situation in Libya at the moment. So Russia has vested interests in Africa. So the way the West kind of tried to pitch this is if Russia's trying to cut off Ukrainian grain supply to African states. It was kind of this emotional appeal to paint Russia in a bad light to these countries, particularly in Francophone countries, as that is where Russia is very much waging this war for influence in Africa, is in the old French colonial empire, where the neo-colonial French empire was until very recently very much still an extant feature. Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and Chad being the big ones here where Russian influence is creeping in. Russia is supplanting particularly French military assets and French influence. So that was kind of where the Western Ukrainian states were trying to push this narrative that Russia is trying to starve you by cutting off grain. An interesting announcement from Moscow over the past couple of days is that we'll have to wait and see if this will happen, because I mean it's effectively a huge amount of charity that Moscow is doing here, if it actually is going to do that at a time while Moscow needs foreign capital and foreign trade to stabilize the rather erratic situation around Russian exports and the ruble. But Moscow has announced that it will replace like for like Ukrainian grain for Russian grain free of charge, which would completely undermine the entire Western narrative trying to undercut Russian influence across Africa. If anything, that would only see the opinion of Russia increase drastically across this Sahel region of Africa and these other states that were formerly importers of Ukrainian grain. So that's kind of the situation. Quick rundown on the grain situation and how it impacts it strategically in regards to both countries. Ukraine's going to have a big knock on its state budget in terms of imports, and it's going to have a lot of grain that it doesn't really know what to do with, because various European countries that neighbor Ukraine have put embargoes or massive tariffs on Ukrainian grain because there was so much Ukrainian grain that wasn't being exported even while the grain deal was there, that they were using it to flood. The big example being the Romanian and particularly the Polish agricultural market, which was completely devastating Polish grain farmers. So Ukraine is sitting on a massive stockpile of grain that it can't really exploit or export at this stage, which is just going to spoil, which is going to undermine a lot of what remains of the Ukrainian agricultural market and a significant hit on the Ukrainian state budget. But like I said, that might be moot because Ukraine is effectively bankrolled by Western benefactors. In terms of Russia, I'm not too sure on the figures of just how much surplus Russia produces in cereals and grains, but if it can certainly pull off the whole massive, effectively charity effort of giving free grain dole to all of sub-Saharan Africa to a large degree, I mean, it would be a massive influential boon for Russia in a region of the world where Russian influence is very much on the rise, in contrast to a lot of the world where it's in decline, particularly in the former Soviet states, Central Asia and the like. But in terms of Africa, it could be a fairly significant geostrategic win for Russia going forward. So that's kind of the really quick rundown on the grain deal and sort of how to envisage the particular ramifications one way or the other of the developments around that. But saying that, this is a developing situation. I believe the Russian deadline is actually for tonight. Midnight tonight is whenever the deadline comes in, and any vessels heading towards Ukrainian ports, the Russians said that they will be valid military targets. So, developing situation. Caveat on everything I've just said. This could all change by tomorrow, but that is kind of as it stands now, my sort of take on it. So now we'll go in a bit more nuanced. Just a quick run up on Wagner. Wagner seems to have largely completely shut down their operations in Russia. It came out that Yevgeny Prigozhin had a one-to-one meeting with Vladimir Putin a number of days after the quote-unquote incident. What exactly was discussed is still open for conjecture, but it seems that there was a ultimatum given to him and around about 35 senior Wagner commanders who were also at this meeting about effectively signing contracts with the military or going into a quasi-exile in Belarus and going on like operations abroad, particularly in Africa. Alongside that, it seems that Wagner has largely completely decamped to Belarus. Their training base down near Taganrog was it? I can't remember specifically. I don't know if it was in Rostov Oblast or in Krasnodar, but their training base has officially shut up shop there, and most of their operations are now set in Belarus. The earmarked Wagner bases have been observed on satellite images expanding quite rapidly. There's been footage of Wagner convoys crossing the border into Belarus and transiting across Belarus. So it seems that the bulk of Wagner is now decamped to Belarus. And interestingly, some reports and footage came out of them actually now training the Belarusian army, which was something I said whenever this was all first announced. That the best use that Belarus could get out of this is to bring in all this pretty good military talent and competency that the professional Wagner Corps has demonstrated, and to put that to use, train up the Belarusian military. So there's a little bit of salvaging there. But the other thing alongside this is that Russia seems intent on going down the purge route. We have not heard from Surovikin in all the months since this has happened. He's effectively dropped off the earth. No one's heard from him, at least publicly. And the purge is expanding outwards. A number of VDV officers and a couple of colonels and guard units were also either arrested or they were sacked from their position because they were too closely linked to Wagner. And there was a Russian general, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he criticized the MOD for incompetent running of tactical operations. And as a result of that, he wasn't completely sacked, but he was relegated in command. He was kicked out of the conflict in Ukraine. This officer was very well regarded from everything I was seeing that was written about him on the Russian military blog channels. But nonetheless, Russia doesn't run by a competency model. He was, if you seem to be competent, you seem to be a threat. That seems to be the mentality in the Russian MOD. And the Russian MOD has kicked him off to Syria. So competent Russian officers seem to be getting arrested or rotated out of command in Ukraine and sent off elsewhere, effectively destroying their careers. Whereas more incompetent officers, but who are ultimately loyal to Shoigu and Gerasimov, are being pushed up in the ranks to take their place. We'll have to wait and see how this all pans out. Obviously doesn't bode well, but saying that, despite the sort of political machinations behind the scenes, it's actually been not too bad a run for the Russian military on the ground the past couple of weeks, if not a month. Despite all this political chaos in Russia, the Russian military has actually been affecting itself not too bad. Hold on a second, I just... Yeah. So, with that aside, we'll just sort of move our way along the front and point out what's been happening here and there as we go along. So, the overall arching story is, on the face of it, Russia actually seems to be doing a fairly well for once. The Ukrainians are having significant troubles still at the front, trying to push through various parts of the Russian defensive line. And the particular thing that keeps coming up again and again is the Russian minefields. Ukrainian troops are having a hell of a time trying to move forward in any direction because everywhere and anything is mined. The fields completely from one end to the other, trench network, towns, whatever Ukrainians actually managed to take, it is just festooned with mines, and that is the big thing that the Ukrainians are constantly complaining about. As if Russian anti-tank guided missiles from ground-based or helo-based platforms, or Russian artillery, or Russian air power, or Russian tanks, or Russian soldiers themselves are, much of a problem that is at the moment. That is multiplied extensively by Russian minefields and defensive fortifications that have just frustrated the Ukrainians from start. So, as you can see, the lines really haven't changed much since I have did the last stream. There's been tangential gains slightly forward for the Ukrainians, but they are very much tangential. The Ukrainians are still stuck effectively at the very front of the Russian defenses. They've reached the very first Russian standoff lines in places, but that's all they've got. They've not reached the secondary lines, let alone the third, or the proper defense in depth, say around down here around Tomak or elsewhere along the lines. So it's not like, for example, Kharkov, or it's not like Kherson last year, where if people kind of sort of cast their minds back, is the slog that was the Kherson campaign last year, where it was very much a touch and go fight between the two, but the Ukrainians did take some land and it was back and forth. But then the Russian positions collapsed because of the logistics situation across the Antonovsky Bridge. Here, it's very much it's kind of the way I'm describing it in my Telegram channel is the Russians are dealing to the Ukrainians what the Ukrainians, right? I swear, if this guy fucking right, sorry, someone had to go for crap. Keeps adding me. Okay, apologies for that. There's always one. So, the Russians are doing to the Ukrainians what the Ukrainians did to the Russians all through last year, which is kind of surprising to me that the Ukrainians would repeat the same problem, really, that they I don't know. So yeah, it surprises me the Ukrainians would fall into the same trap that they dealt to the Russians, if that makes sense. So if people can remember, last year the Russians went for this, which I still maintain was a rather idiotic strategy of slamming their head against the strongest Ukrainian defenses in the Donbass for months. It seems that the Ukrainians are now doing the same. And this has a number of pretty substantial ramifications, which the Russians are seemingly taking advantage of at the moment. So, the major areas of fighting over here to the east of Vasiliivka. Vasiliivka down here is, if people can remember, this is usually where the prisoner exchanges and stuff happen. That is where that sort of goes on in this sort of area. As you can see, the Ukrainians have just managed to ford across the river, which I believe is mostly dried up at the moment, and taken a slight bit of land, but it's really negligible. This is a part of the front which I believe that the Ossetian units from North and South Ossetia, ethnic Ossetian units, were holding this part of the line. The other big area is Robotny over here, which the Ukrainians are just starting to fight on the outskirts of. This is a bit more of a territorial gain for the Ukrainians, but as you can see, there's really not much here. It's just open fields, and it's effectively minefields. And the real area of significant fighting remains the area in sort of the Mariinka area south of Novosilka. As you can see, this is a bit more territory which the Ukrainians have managed to take, but it really isn't much in the grand scheme of things. It's blunted a Russian salient into the Ukrainian lines, but the Ukrainians have effectively remained stuck at this position for about 2-3 weeks now and haven't really managed to advance further on. Ukrainian Defense Forces have success at Vielka and Novosilka. The General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine say don't really trust not really going to take the word of the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces here until we see visual evidence. So the Ukrainians are really kind of slamming their heads against these minefields and against these substantial Russian defense positions, and the costs seem to be fairly high in terms of material and in terms of men. In terms of the actual number of like Leopard 2s that have been sent, I think it's somewhere around about, I think we're approaching 10 that's been destroyed, which doesn't sound a lot in the grand scheme of things, but in terms of the actual recorded number of Leopard tanks in Ukraine at the moment, it's a fairly hefty percentage. Alongside that, there's significant numbers of Soviet legacy equipment, your BMP-1s and 2, your T-72 models and T-64s. The T-72s particularly given from Western states like the Czechs, the Poles. Those M113 APCs, the Dutch gave in large numbers. They have been taking a heavy toll for this. The Max Pro Internationals and the various MRAPs as well, they saving the lives of a lot of Ukrainian troops whenever they hit a mine, but hitting the mine puts them out of action, and there's been a significant attrition on those kind of vehicles and systems throughout this offensive so far. So materially, the costs seem to be fairly steep for the Ukrainians. A bit more nuanced on the Russian side. The Russians are taking losses, but we're not seeing, well, in terms of visually confirmed evidence, we're seeing about an equal number on both sides. But obviously both sides are not taking pictures of what is being destroyed of their own side and posting it all across the internet. So it's a bit hard to really judge just how much is being lost on either side. But on the Russian side, what has become very apparent to me is what the Ukrainians do put out footage of that they're destroying on the Russian side in this part of the front is your sort of behind the lines system, your support systems, your Russian artillery batteries, your Russian air defense systems. So, for example, there's a lot of Ukrainian drone footage coming out of like the MSTBs, the Russian self-propelled artillery systems, the heavy ones, Russian heavy mortars, things like that. Support assets for the Russians behind the lines seem to be the big target for the Ukrainians rather than the sort of very frontline units, the tanks and stuff that you would expect. At the very front, physically engaging the Ukrainians is Ukrainian drones and artillery seem to be more trying to pick apart the Russian support elements behind the line. I think I mentioned this briefly in my last stream, but what seems to happen is whenever the Ukrainians restart an offensive action, let's say over here in the Robotny, so let's say the Ukrainians have eased off the attack for a couple days, then they decide to make another push in the Robotny area, and they put in a couple of armored and mechanized assets to really kick up a fuss. Just before they do that, or around about the time they commence that offensive operation, is they'll flood the area behind the lines with as much drones as they can to try. So whenever battle starts up here near Robotny, is these drones are on the hunt for like Russian artillery systems behind the lines. And then that's whenever your long-range Ukrainian artillery or your HIMARS systems or the like starts to try and engage that Russian artillery. That seems to be the modus operandi at the moment for the Ukrainians in doing that. I think it's kind of more one of the only things the Ukrainians can really do at this stage, going by the trouble that they're having actually breaching the line, is trying to undermine the Russian force multipliers here. Because what seems to be happening is the Russians seem to have largely vacated the defense in depth to a large degree. Whenever the Ukrainian counteroffensive began, is they moved up. So defense in depth is you should have like defensive lines in various, like say on a 10-kilometer long stretch going from the front all the way back here from Tomak, is you'd have about maybe 4 or 5 defensive lines, and you'd have troops and tanks and assets in each defensive line. So if the Ukrainians breached one, they would then come to a stronger, more heavily defended line. If they breached that, they would then come to an even more stronger and even more heavily defended line further back. The idea is just the further the Ukrainians penetrate, the more pressure builds up as they go. But also the other aspect for defense in depth is you should allow the Ukrainians in some respects to break through so that they could overstretch themselves. So say if the Ukrainians did manage to break through Tomak, then maybe their logistics line to support this thrust towards the city would be open to Russian counterattacks on the flanks from defensive positions that haven't been quashed to the left or the right. That's kind of your defense in depth, is it's land for time kind of equation. The Russians seem to have vacated that, even if that was even ever the plan. And they seem to have moved forward all their assets to these frontal lines to face the Ukrainians at the standoff positions and keep them relegated there. Maybe that's because this is where the Russians have mostly concentrated their minefields, and they've realized that's a good trick. This is working well for them. So we might as well push up all our forces up to the front and keep the Ukrainians sort of floundering in these minefields. but also put them under direct attack from our infantry and armored and mechanized assets that were on defensive positions further back. That could be another aspect of the Russian strategy here, but nonetheless, it's not. Even Americans, maybe. I've even seen some Ukrainians starting to say that the offensive really isn't going to plan, and it really hasn't from day one. Maybe there's something that we're not seeing here. Maybe there's some kind of great Ukrainian 4D chess operations going on that we haven't seen, but so far it's really not come to fruition. The only other thing that really seems to be happening is the Ukrainians trying to pick apart Russian logistics. It's kind of gone down a grade over the past couple of weeks. So the Ukrainians were very big on hitting rail lines and road infrastructure coming out of Crimea. That's eased off a bit. But kind of on the flip side is, of course, we had the attack on the Kerch bridge this week as well, of what seems to be a waterborne drone. But even then, it only disrupted one span of the road bridge. I think the bigger logistics hub for the Russians is very much the rail connection rather than the roads. But one span of the road is still operational, and the rail bridge was not damaged at all. So I don't think it was more a symbolic and propaganda victory than I think it was an actual serious disruption of Russian logistics into Crimea and southern Ukraine. So it really doesn't seem to be going too well for the Ukrainians at the moment. The counteroffensive at this stage seems to be falling behind all expectations that were set for it. Another aspect which I need to sort of bring up in of itself, probably in its own stream whenever I actually get around to talking about the dam, is this reservoir has largely completely dried out, and Russian figures, particularly Igor Strelkov, he's very big on this. He's starting to ring alarm bells saying that what the Ukrainians are doing over here in Zaporozhye and into Donetsk Oblast, that's actually the sideshow. Is that this is kind of the whole feint, the Kharkov feint Redux 2.0 kind of thing, is that while the Russians are more focused over here, is they're not paying attention too much as they should be on the drying out of the reservoir and of the Dnieper, and that the Ukrainians might try and cross the Dnieper in force in a flanking Kharkov style lightning attack. Not too sure how much stock I'd put into that or how feasible it is, but much of the reservoir has dried out, and the Dnieper is extremely small compared to where it was before the collapse of the dam. So also the other aspect is that there was a Ukrainian fording party that crossed about a week and a half ago at the Antonovsky Bridge and has set up shop on the Russian side of the bank of the river, and the Russians have yet to properly evict them, if they are even trying to evict them from that bank of Dnieper. So just a couple of thoughts there. Flying through this, like I say, my throat is a bit sore today, and I'm feeling a little under the weather, so not as extensive a stream as I'd liked, but I'm trying to get through it. So the other aspect is, in fact, before we go into the Russian side of thing, we'll push up north to Bakhmut and outline what's been happening there. Ukrainian offensive action continues in Bakhmut in a fairly regular pace. As you can see, they have effectively completely blunted the old northern and southern pincers that Wagner fought dearly to establish to the north and south of Bakhmut. And as you can see, Kilishchivka here is now in the grey zone. Kilishchivka is a bit of a vital tactical objective for both sides, because this is actually on high ground. And it was a big problem for the Ukrainians when the Russians first took it, because it allowed the Russians Wagner to spill out into these fields, and they originally set up the whole southern flank of Bakhmut. If the Ukrainians are able to retake Kilishchivka, it gives them a line of sight and potentially a line of fire onto Russian logistics from the south, up into Bakhmut itself. Heavy fighting continues in the area. There's some indication that the Russians have maybe stabilized the line a bit more compared to recent weeks. So still a fluid situation there. To the north, pardon me, this is kind of where the Ukrainians have shifted the focus of their operations in the Bakhmut area. Ukrainian offensive action has continued over the past couple of days around the old Kharkivka reservoir. And as you can see, they are starting potentially, I'm not too sure of the specific situation here at the moment, but there's potentiality that the Ukrainians might start to push into the urban northern suburbs of Bakhmut. So you're sort of Hidny. I can't remember the name for this specific area. I'm not too sure if that's, but sort of might see the repeat of the battles that Wagner did take these areas. If the Ukrainians are able to start to push back into the urban areas itself. But saying that, a lot of Ukrainians are starting to hype up, the second battle of Bakhmut, the liberation of Bakhmut, is on the way. Bit of an X to doubt, even if the things go well for the Ukrainians in the north of the city. We're still going to be months away before the Ukrainians start to fight in the city and have any hopes of taking the city itself in any time soon. It will be another brutal fight, and the city is in effect ruins. And it might sound a bit strange, but it's a lot easier to defend a pile of ruins than it is to defend a city. And very much, I think, unless the Russians completely cock it up, I think the defense very much favors the Russians if there's going to be a second battle of Bakhmut. But I think we're probably a long way off from that eventuality coming anytime soon. Because we're now going to switch over to what the Russians have been doing. And while the Ukrainians have been hammering their head against the wall down here in Zaporozhye and Donetsk, they have done what the Russians did last year, and that is they've effectively ceded the initiative. The initiative in warfare is kind of which side chooses where to fight, when, and where. Well, if the Ukrainians are kind of invested in this battle down here, they're bogged down in the fight in here. It's allowed the Russians to free up and have a bit more freedom of movement elsewhere in the front. So we've seen Russian offensive action start to pick up in the Mariivka area and to the area north of it, but also in the Diivka area. The Russians are launching a few more probing attacks, but the big story, which I'm keeping a close eye on, is that the Russians are really starting to pick up the pace up here to the north in the Kharkov and Luhansk fronts. Particularly up here, it seems to be that the large Russian objective that they're moving towards is Kupiansk. There's been various conjectures and posts about hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers and 900 tanks. X to doubt. Don't think it's going to be that many, but Russian offensive action has been slowly building a momentum over the past few months. All the way along here, down the P66 road, all the way down to Kramina. The Russians are slowly picking up steam and starting to claw back territory. Particularly up here in the north, it seems that they are advancing down and hugging the Oskol River. Obviously, a river is a pretty good defensive object to have on your flank. And it seems to be that's what the Russians are pinning themselves against as they slowly make their way down towards Kupiansk and the vital road and bridge connections across the Oskol River, which might give the Russians a bit of a toehold and open up a few more options for the Russians maybe to try and retake some parts of Kharkov Oblast that they lost last year during the during the Kharkov offensive. Just a second. So, forgive me. There's also Russian offensive action further to the south. The Russians have taken some lines along this small river that's here, particularly I think it's this area where I think it is Novohorivka. I think that might be the part, or the Novovodian. Either way, it's along here. The Russians were able to take one of the towns slash villages in this area and establish new positions along this little rivulet here as well, slowly building up offensive power and momentum in their operations in this area as well. But also crucially, and perhaps a bit more pertinently, is along the Crimea to Krasny Liman axis, is the Russians are making a fair bit of headway along the road. And apparently people in Liman, people can remember the Battle of Liman last year that went on for months that we were all paying close attention to. People in Liman can once again start to hear the fighting to the east of the city. So if the Ukrainians aren't able to stiffen the lines and prevent this sort of Russian push, if the Russians are able to effect this, we might see the second Battle of Liman with maybe this side of winter. If not this side of winter, I would imagine potentially next year for Russian offensive action. Is Liman would probably be one of the more realistic goals that I could see the Russians going for. I think this is, I've made a couple of pronouncements in the Telegram group over the past couple of weeks about just what the Russians can really feasibly expect going forward in the war, going by previous experience, their idiotic decision to start purging their more competent officers, and in terms of losses and stuff. Depending on how much the Ukrainians decide to expand on the offensive in Zaporozhye and Kherson, I really don't think that there's much in terms of territory that the Ukrainians can hope to take in Zaporozhye and potentially much of Donetsk. I think in this part, this whole southern area of the war, I think it's very much just sort of nip and tuck in terms of territorial changes, unless there's a significant change. That's kind of where I think there really isn't much more in terms of territorial acquisition the Russians can conceivably and feasibly expect to take going forward, at least in the near to medium term. I think where the Russians can really make a bit of ground going forward is up on this northern front, particularly in the Kharkov area, but also I'm looking around here at this Siversk salient here. If the Russians can hold all their territory around Bakhmut and Soledar, and if this Russian offensive up in Kharkov retakes Krasny Liman, this Ukrainian salient in Siversk becomes extremely untenable. You'll have Russian forces to the north of the river, but most everything in the Ukrainian in this salient would be under Russian artillery range, and it would be covered on pretty hard to defend fronts. And also the logistics in this area are not very good. There's only a couple of paved roads. So the sustainability of a significant Ukrainian defensive position in Siversk would become untenable from what I can see. This is why Kharkov was kind of such a big slap in the face to the Russians last year. If the Russians still held this territory and then Wagner was to come along and retake Bakhmut, it would have made the Siversk salient probably completely untenable and have forced a Ukrainian evacuation of their own accord, or it would have been a battle very much on Russia's terms had that scenario come about. But also, this is the only territory. I think there might be there's a bit of a sliver territory here, but Bilherovka, this infamous town here, which has been the bane of Russian military operations for more than a year now. This is the largest settlement that the Ukrainians maintain control of in all of Luhansk Oblast. If the Ukrainians were to lose Bilherovka, then the Russians could legitimately, I would say at that stage, they can say all of Luhansk is being quote unquote liberated. The only other territory that's left is some forest, and like you can see, just small hamlets in farmland further up north in Kharkov Oblast. But even then, that might return return to Russian control over the coming weeks and months, depending on how this sort of Russian opportunistic offensive operations to the north take shape. So this is kind of where I see that if there is going to be a sort of some good news for the Russians on the medium term, this is probably where it's going to come. The retaking of territories lost from the Kharkov offensive, but maybe they could collapse the Seversk salient. And then if the Russians are still wedded to the idea of taking Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, well, this puts the Russians within a significant might be too strong of a word, but it moves the front closer to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. As you can see, since the Russians lost the northern flank last year, they're nowhere close to taking Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. But if they take Bakhmut, Seversk, Liman, I think it's probably a bit out of scope at this stage, but say they were able to retake Izium, then I think that's whenever we could start to talk about the potentiality of an actual battle of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk happening in a, say, from whatever time frame these gains are taken. After that, I think that would be the next logical step of any operation that would happen in Ukraine on the Russian side of things. So, see what some of these markers say. A bunch of Ukrainian staff report. Russian cross-border challenge. So, pretty sure I mentioned it, but just in case I didn't, it should be said that one response of the Russian actions to the collapse of the grain deal is that the Russians are also going very strongly after the port infrastructure in Odessa. So in the absence of physically sinking ships, it seems that the Russians are just going to completely remove the port itself from play. So just in case I didn't mention that, the opening spiel about the grain deal. Short and sweet. I think that's kind of everything I was immediately off the top of my head of what I wanted to say. So I'll leave it up to you, chat. Is there anything in chat that you guys want to ask? Because I know there's a couple other things that I was looking to cover, but they've slipped my mind at the moment. This is why I really jot down notes. Grain deal touched Wagner to a degree. The nuclear plant hasn't exploded, despite the constant pleas of such from both Ukraine and Russia. The nuclear plant seems to be plugging along pretty well. Why do you keep banning people? Because people ask to be banned because they're idiots. And if you've been banned, it's because you've done something to abuse my goodwill or just being a complete spurg in chat. That's why people get banned. I rarely ban people. The mods ban people because they are spammers. I ban people because they either are just too much of a glow. They glow too much in chat and they just aren't worth the risk. Like this person in chat who keeps at me at the moment, he was banned because he kept insisting on saying a certain racial slur, which I do allow in chat, but he kept using it to such an extent it was just becoming a liability, and I don't need such people who can't control themselves to cause troubles in my chat, because I don't want my Telegram group to be censored on Google App Store on mobile devices, or I don't want something some idiotic spurg has said in my chat to bring unwanted attention from media or state actors in my chat. If you want to just spurg out like an idiot and constantly say racial slurs in every single thing you post, you can do it somewhere else. I don't want it in my chat. Like, I don't ban people for saying racial slurs. Like, if you know, my attitude towards that is, you know, use it sparingly. The best things are done in moderation. If you're just going to spam it across my chat, you can go somewhere else. Or if all you ever do is post in my chat attacking me or just constantly spit and fire at me, like, yeah, okay. If you hate me and my content so much, then I'll help you to leave so you don't have to see my content. That's really the only two reasons. That and viciously attacking other people in chat for no good reason. Those are like, yeah, the three reasons I will ban someone from chat. I might mute a person in chat. There's a difference between being banned and muted. I mostly mute people in chat, so they can't post for a day or maybe even a week if it's really egregious. In terms of like an outright ban, yeah, those are like the three reasons that will get you a ban in chat. And even then, I don't really keep the bans. Like, I'll ban you, and then like probably a couple weeks later, I'll go through the ban list and unban people. I don't like banning people. I try to allow people to say what they want, but if you abuse that and just throw it back in my face, I'm not obligated to just sit there and take it. Like, I did that last year, and idiots in chat chased off all the Ukrainians and all the Russians that used to post in chat. So my tolerance for it is long since evaporated. Like, I try to keep it light-hearted and humorous in chat, but I mean, if you're just going to rip the piss out of it, sorry, you can go somewhere else. What's the Russian cope about the bridge being hit again? I don't know if I'm just not paying attention, but I haven't really seen any copes about it. I guess the only real cope is that they keep saying it's Ukrainian terrorism. I don't know if you'd class that as a cope, but I mean, I don't think the Russians are really coping about it. They've collapsed the grain deal and they've been hitting Odessa pretty hard in response to it. I don't know if that would come under the classification of a cope or not, but what do you think of the American soldier who defected to North Korea? I really don't know too much about the situation. I haven't paid much attention to it. The only thing I've managed to see is that I think he was in a military stockade, and he was due for military disciplining because he committed crimes during his service in Korea, and he somehow got out of the stockade or something, and then he defected. And even if that is true, that's all I know about the situation. I really don't know too much about it. How goes your recent waging? It's tiring, and I'm not too sure if it's worth it, to be honest. The amount of time that I stick into it is, I'm not sure if it's overly worth it, to be honest. But else? What was that about the rods from God? Oh yeah. So the Russian ammo, there was this very weird post that came out. In fact, I'll find it in the chat. And it's just so Russian in everything about it. Go to message. So it's from a channel called Brief, which is a Russian. Yeah, it's a Russian language channel. I think it's like a news aggregation channel. So this is the original post, and this is the translation of it. So, what if, to sum it up before I go in depth into reading it, is that the Russian space agency Roscosmos is looking into trying to develop Soyuz rockets or something to drop aircraft bombs on Ukraine, which sounds pretty insane, pretty cool, but also pretty insane. I don't even think it's feasible, but I'll just read it for the the sake of brevity for people who can't quite read it on stream, and I know a lot of people just listen to this in the background as opposed to pay attention to the stream screen itself. So post from a channel called Brief on Telegram. The channel itself is called Rus Brief. The original post was in Russian Cyrillic, and this is the translation that came out. Former head of Roscosmos, Dmitry Rogozhin, proposes to Russian President Vladimir Putin to destroy NATO equipment with high explosive aerial bombs launched from the Vostochny and Pilitsk cosmodromes, as it became known to Brief. A conversation about this took place between Rogozhin and the general director of the Progress Rocket and Space Center, Dmitry Baranov. Oh, person. Second, I know someone personal Baranov. I wonder if this guy's done. Rogozhin, quote, "Is it possible to launch FABs?" FABs being Russian airdrop, well, Soviet era and Russian aerial drop munitions. This is the stuff you put on jets, and the jets drop them. So effectively, aircraft bombs to launch FABs from spaceports. Baranov, this is a supersonic re-entry into atmospheric, and the existing heavy FABs do not work. They start to overheat. The question is what is thrown, reaches the ground, does not burn out. The speed is more than 6 kilometers per second. This is practically space speed. It is like the Soyuz TMA is coming back. That's the re-entry vehicle for the Russian spacecraft whenever their cosmonauts come back to Earth. Same bullshit. Rogozhin, toys of the MIT, the Moscow Institute of Thermal Engineering, may well be suitable. What is the mass delivered to the point? How many tons? How long will it take to prepare all this bullshit? I'm just meeting today with a man who will see our great and terrible in 3 days. I'm just reading the translation. I'm aware that the translation doesn't quite translate as coherent a sentence from Russian into English as it otherwise should be, but I think you sort of get the gist. Baranov, quote, "From the east, 7.5 tons. From the north, 10 tons. For insurance, subtract a ton. Standard adaptation is 6 to 9 months, so that's the time that they would retrofit a Soyuz rocket to carry an aircraft bomb conceivably into orbit. We just don't understand what to do. The top of the launch vehicle, what should the end look like?" Rogozhin, I spoke with Wagner. He became interested. He asked me to submit a paper on Monday to report to the boss, Vladimir Putin, on this matter. I handed over the paper. It will be with the same Supreme Commander on the 14th. So, Russia is really exceeding itself. They're going to start putting, like, the Russian equivalent of a JDAM bomb on a Soyuz rocket and fire it into space with the idea of, like, blowing up a tank in Ukraine. Not too sure if that's the best use for the billions of rubles that would go into retrofitting Soyuz rockets, building the Soyuz rockets, getting the rocket fuel for the Soyuz rockets, putting those rockets into orbit, and then having an entire Roscosmos Center calculate the trajectory of where they should drop this bomb. It sounds really cool, but is it really the best use of resources? I'm not too sure. It's not quite rods from God, and as Baranov says in the statement, is it's more likely that the bombs would just burn up in the atmosphere. If they don't physically completely burn up like meteors or something, I would imagine the intense heat of re-entry might just detonate the bombs themselves up in the atmosphere. So I'm not a physicist. I'm not a mathematician. I really not scientifically minded, though I really love science. But I think this is probably one of the more eccentric Russian ideas that they've come out with. Pretty cool, but probably not the most feasible thing and most efficient use of Russian resources, to be honest. Yeah, and that's kind of my probably a bit hyperbolic, but that's kind of how I conceive that the Russians would carry this out, is if the Russians are going to start bombing Ukraine from space. If it doesn't look like that, I would probably be a little bit disappointed, to be honest. So that was the whole Russian rods from God scenario that they seem to have submitted to the president. You were wrong about Wagner. In what sense? Could Lukashenko end up using his newfound power of Wagner to try to push to become Putin's successor or leader of a Union state? No, I don't think so. I think that ship sailed in the early 2000s. The best thing that Lukashenko could do is use them to train up the Belarusian military, to build up capability and understanding, but also see if he can just base Wagner, like its business operations, in Belarus. Let Wagner go off to the Central African Republic, let it go off across Africa and do its stuff. Protect these diamond and gold mines, build up these relations with African states, and then just like tell Wagner, look, you have a base in Belarus, pay us tax on it, bring in income and resources to the Belarusian state budget. We're happy. As long as you don't try and overthrow us, you're happy. Like that's kind of, it's a win-win situation for Lukashenko then, is like how I perceive it. And also the presence of Wagner is just kind of like this big publicly scary idea in like Poland and for Ukraine. It would cause them to deploy assets along the borders of Belarus to kind of like protect against that, even as unfeasible as the idea of like Wagner invading Poland or Belarus, going for Kiev 2.0 might be. But that's kind of like the smart way to play with the cards that Wagner has been dealt. So hi, and did you find anyone on the Russian side to do a podcast? Did you see the interview from a YouTuber, Billy OAM? No, I didn't. No one came forward. Again, I think that's because I foolishly allowed my lingering libertarian ideals of free speech to chase out all the Russians that were in chat last year, frustratingly. And I'm not familiar with that YouTuber that you've named, so forgive me, I can't really comment much, so I haven't seen that video. Thanks for doing these streams. Thank you for coming and watching them. I hope they're of use to some of you guys. No super chats today, and chat has been fairly small today. Yes, I haven't been streaming a lot, so people have kind of probably drifted off to a degree. So unless there's anything final you guys want to throw at me, might start to wrap it up. If you do like these streams and you aren't already subscribed, I would ask if you might kindly consider subscribing to the YouTube and maybe giving the video a like. If you're not in the Telegram, I highly recommend you go there if you're really interested in this stuff on a day-to-day basis. This is where I'm sharing stuff from the Russian and Ukrainian side of things. If you are that way minded and you would like to support me financially, do forgive the shill, but I need to do it every once in a while. I mean to revamp the coffee accounts in the next few days, next couple of weeks or so. But if you are that way minded, I would ask if you might consider checking out the coffee account, coffee.com/DELABROC, Delabrock, and maybe consider throwing us a couple of pounds, rubles. Very much would appreciate that. If it's a one-off or a recurring thing, it's all greatly appreciated and helps motivate me to continue screaming ether. If you don't really want to deal with coffee, I do have a PayPal account, link to, which is a bit more easier to jump onto. upload. Yeah. So the links are in the description to this stream below. There's a link on PayPal for one-off, weekly, or monthly donations. All greatly appreciated. Like I say, helps keep this stuff afloat. Links to all my social media accounts are linked on a link tree, which is also linked before. Telegram, YouTube, Twitter, Odyssey, Instagram, yada yada yada. If you're interested in following me on other stuff. Russians fought only Yukis left. I'm not sure what you're specifically referring to there. Do you think there will be any accident or purposeful damage of the nuclear power plant? Not really, no. Might be some shelling here, but I think that ship has kind of probably long since sailed. I think both sides kind of jumped the shark a week, 2 weeks ago, whenever they really hammed up the idea that there was going to be a massive disaster or whatever. As malicious as either side might be, I don't think they are suicidal into creating that a Chernobyl 2.0. Even if that's possible at this stage, because reactors are pretty run down at the moment. The Kakhovka Dam is one thing. You can rebuild dams. Creating a radiological contamination of a large area. I think that's probably a step too far for either side to intentionally cause. Might be a bit of, shenanigans here or there, but I'm not really expecting much. I think the whole drama around the nuclear power plant is kind of, I think that ship has sailed and kind of just a sideshow. People hear the term nuclear power plant and then they get excited over it. But like I say, from my understanding, is the reactors are effectively inert at this stage, have long since been run down in capacity. So, yeah. With that, I guess I'll start to wrap it up properly. So yeah, like I say, come follow me on Twitter and my other various stuff. And yeah, not too sure what my schedule is going to be like going into the weekend or into next week, but I'll try and get these streams back up on a weekly basis. Alongside the little wagey job that I'm doing, I'm also kind of restarting a previous business that I did, so might be a bit pushed for time, but I'd like to try and get these streams back on a weekly basis. So keep your eye out for those. So with that, thank you everyone who popped along. But do you think the Russians will actually sink any ships leaving or going to Ukraine? If any of them actually do, yeah, they probably will try and do it, but I don't think that any shipping is going to be suicidal enough to try that. The only way I think that ships will try and get into Ukraine will if they hug the Romanian coast and go and slip into Ukrainian waters. Try and keep under like the Ukrainian anti-air defense shield. But I think if the Russians have just kind of really damaged the port, I think it's just kind of a moot point. I'm not really expecting any shipping to enter in Ukrainian ports anytime soon. So, see, yeah. With that, going to sign it off here, guys. I hope it's been a bit, and well, entertaining is probably the wrong word, but enlightening as to what's been happening in Ukraine over the past couple of weeks, and hopefully see you guys soon. And a bit of a quick one, but like I say, bit of a sore throat. Speak to you guys soon. See ya.